As mentioned, my name is Maryam Tohidi, and I'm excited to be here today talking about a topic that I'm really passionate about, building products. And more specifically, building the right product and getting it right. So to tell you a little bit about my background, I come from a computer science background. And from there, I found my way into the world of user experience, namely user experience research. And along the way, I've worked at companies like T-Mobile, Google, YouTube, and Facebook as a UX researcher. So where did my curiosity for building products begin? Probably like many of you, I started kind of building things, experiences, through Legos, through putting together different toys, pillows, and blankets. So those are some of the building blocks that I started out with in terms of building products and shaping up experiences since I was really young. Having started computer science, my first professional experience building products started out in building software. So 15 years ago, I got my first job as a software developer at a company called Cognos in Canada. Cognos is a software development company that built business intelligence software. So I was working as a front-end developer for a product called Upfront, which was a web-based tool where business professionals could query their data sources and build and kind of export dashboards and reports and such. So at the beginning, the first few months of my job were really kind of fixing bugs in other people's codes. I wasn't building anything new into the product. As I got more experience, I got more exciting projects. So I started getting some new features that we were building into Upfront. And I remember that this was super exciting. These were small little features that were being added to a product that's been out there for several years. But there was this feeling of excitement about building something new into the experience. And I remember that this feeling of excitement was also coupled with some uncertainty and unease. This new feature that I was building, what should it be called? Where in the long menu of things should I place it? Will people find it there? Will they like it? Will they know how to use it? I wanted to build this new feature the best way that I knew how, but I wasn't sure if I was building the right product or getting it right. Back in those days at Cognos, we didn't have a design or research team. So feature requests would often come from our sales team, and then it would be handed over to engineering, where we would prioritize, design, and build them the best way that we knew how. And this is how I found myself at University of Toronto, doing my graduate studies in HCI. Back in Toronto, I knew about this guy, Bill Buxton. He was known as one of the founding fathers of this field, human-computer interaction. And he happened to be working on a brand new book about sketching user experiences. The sketching part really kind of resonated with me as an art enthusiast. And I started talking with Bill, who at the time was doing research and writing about designing user experiences, about low-fidelity prototyping. So let's say that you're building a new product and you start sketching and you come up with some design ideas. How do you know that you're on the right track with your design before you dive further in? So it was questions like that that started to pique my interest and became the foundation of my thesis that I did at University of Toronto with Bill as my advisor. And I spent the next couple of years thinking and writing about getting the right design and the design right. The paper that we published in CHI 2006 actually summarized my thesis. So let's say for the sake of this experiment that you are a company building new thermostats. Early in the design process, your design team comes up with 3 very different ideas for thermostat. And these are all kind of giving the same sort of functionality to the people, the basic things that you do to the thermostat, but they have 3 very different design paradigms. What do you do next? So had this been an actual company at the time, they would probably pick one of these designs based on what they liked or what was most feasible, and they would go from the sketching phase to prototyping it, hopefully doing some sort of research before they started building it. And at the time, the most common type of user research would have been a usability study. So I'd imagine they would build a prototype and put it in a usability study. They would find some problems, they would improve those, iterate, and eventually build a thermostat that they thought worked really well. So in my thesis, I compared this process, which was the status quo, to something that was new at the time. And that was testing multiple different designs within the same usability study. How would it be different for users? What would their ratings and their feedback be like if they saw one design versus multiple in the same session? So for this, we did an experiment. This was an in-between participants, between subjects experiment where some of our participants only saw one of the three designs and others saw all three. And what did we find? We found that participants' subjective rating of the designs changed. So those who only saw one design, they would tend to rate the design higher. And those who saw all three, they felt more comfortable to give lower, arguably more fair ratings to the designs. We also found that participants who saw all three designs gave us more and more critical feedback. So if, at the end of this session, I asked somebody who had seen one design, like, what would you change? What would you improve? They might have said nothing, or they would come up with something like maybe somewhat on the superficial side. So like maybe they would change the color of something or the placement of a button. But those who saw all three, they were able to give us much more critical feedback. So if there was something really wrong with the design, they could point out bigger design flaws. And finally, by exposing our participants to multiple designs, we gave them the chance to pick their favorite, and more importantly, to reject the other designs in favor of the better designs that they would have seen. So, for example, a participant would have said, if I had to pick, I would pick this one. That first one, I would not use it at all. So just like, I wouldn't use that at all wasn't something that any of the participants who only saw one of the designs ever said. In fact, in all of my experience, in most usability studies, I've never heard somebody saying, like, I wouldn't use this at all. Like, you need to go back to the drawing board. Because people don't want to hurt your feelings. And also because they may not really be able to imagine the range of possibilities that there are until you design some of them, put it in front of them, and give them the chance to compare and contrast and give you more meaningful feedback. So to summarize, my research showed that by exploring the design space more holistically, by coming up with meaningfully different designs, and by exposing those designs to your participants and getting feedback, you can work on getting the right design. So before diving in and improving and perfecting that design, you want to make sure that you have the right design. And once you feel comfortable with that, then you can, of course, iterate and improve until you get the design right. So that was back in 2006. Let's fast forward to now. The title of my talk is Getting the Right Product and Getting It Right. And I haven't focused so much on design. And I like to think that this has been kind of a shift in my approach based on everything that I've done since that thermostat project. So having worked in industry and built entirely new products, or kind of improving and evolving existing products that millions of people use, I've had to think beyond getting the right design. So first and foremost, I've had to make sure that I help my team find a product that's worth building, something that actually people want to use, and that's solving a need, and preferably something that's solving the most fundamental needs in an elegant and approachable way. So you notice that back in the thermostat project, I just said that, let's say you're a company building the next thermostat, and then I spend the rest of the project on finding and perfecting the right design for the thermostat. But I didn't do any research or question at the beginning if people even needed a new thermostat. Like, if a better designed thermostat was available in the market, would they actually go out and replace their existing one? Might be unlikely. Had I done that differently, I would have wanted to understand if there was any kind of unmet need or longing or desire. Maybe the actual need was that people wanted to save money on their utilities bill. Or maybe they had a desire to live a more environmentally friendly lifestyle. So had we understood that like nugget of the user need, we might have designed a completely different product from the ones that I was exploring. Really at the fundamental level, I've learned along these years that I need to start at looking at the underlying human needs, motivations, pain points and drivers, and so on. That we can actually find products that people are willing to new products that they're willing to purchase, or new services that they're willing to sign up for, and products that they actually want to come back over and over again and use in their lives. What I've learned is to start by deeply understanding people, their motivations, drivers, tensions, pain points, context, all of those. Then from that, identify product opportunity areas that actually resonate and speak to a real user need. I've also learned to inform and energize my product teams, to take them along the journey, get them excited about this new product opportunity that they can start innovating, and encourage them to come up with lots of ideas before they zero in on the one product that they want to build or the one design that they want to perfect. So really taking the designers, engineers, and PMs and everybody else along this journey with me to identify the right product opportunity, to find the right product in that domain, then to dive into finding the right design, and finally getting that design right. And my job as a researcher along this journey is to help them understand people. So what are some tools that a researcher could use along this, this product journey? There are many, and I'm sure many of you are using a lot of the ones that I'm going to talk about, but the ones that I found to be most useful in the companies and teams that I've worked on are these. So for identifying the product opportunity, I found pathfinding research and trend forecasting to be really valuable tools. For finding the right product, I found design sprints and concept testing against the benchmark to be really effective. For finding the right design, participatory design, or testing multiple design ideas with your participants, like I mentioned earlier. And finally, for getting the design right, more usability studies, more iteration, and experiments are some of the tools that I've used. And again, I'm sure that you're familiar with a lot of these and use them in your practice. And if I had to guess which one of these might be piquing your curiosity a little bit more, I don't know for sure, but I'm going to go with pathfinding research. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about for the rest of this talk. So what is pathfinding research? The version that I know and that I'm going to share with you today is actually a new discipline of research at Facebook. It's also a new job title, pathfinding researcher. And that's the job that I signed up to do a year and a half ago when I joined Facebook. So you can imagine that Facebook has a really large research team. And our research leadership in the last couple of years have really started to push the entire team to look further and further out into the future. So most of our researchers actually have a dedicated product area, and naturally they spend a lot of their time thinking about the next 6 months because our product teams plan their goals around 3 and 6 month intervals. So as a researcher, to support your team, you're thinking about what is your team launching in the next 6 months. But we're all being pushed, of course, to think well beyond this 6 month period, to think further out into the future, beyond the milestones and goals that our product teams are worrying about. And that's the job of every researcher, whether your name includes the word pathfinding or not. But outside of this push to look further out into the future, Facebook has also invested in dedicated research headcount that purely thinks about finding the next product opportunity and shaping the future of our products. And this is the new discipline of pathfinding that I talked about. They're researchers who, for the most part, think further out into the future. And I was really excited to be joining as a pathfinding researcher when I joined Facebook last year. How does pathfinding work at Facebook? Well, it's still a relatively new discipline, so I would say that we're still learning and experimenting and trying it out and kind of improving it as we go. And you might be wondering, where does pathfinding researchers sit in our organization? And the answer is twofold. There's actually 2 different places. We are a culture of A/B testing after all, and I guess we're doing a little bit of that in terms of testing the different ways and places where pathfinding research could fit into the organization. So some pathfinding research is actually sitting within product areas, and there's another team, there's a central team that another group of pathfinding researchers are kind of sitting in this central team.
The ones who are embedded in the product area are dedicated to a given part of the experience and figuring out what the future of it is. So for example, we have a pathfinding researcher for newsfeed or for Facebook stories. The team that's sitting more centrally is tasked with thinking kind of beyond our current organizational lines and beyond the things that Facebook already is offering. So what is the future of entirely new experiences that maybe you haven't thought about and don't have product teams around? In the last year and a half, I actually had the chance to work in both of these models, and I can tell you that they have their own pros and cons. If you're sitting within a product area, I thought that some of the benefits is that you actually have dedicated stakeholders that are invested in your research. So the head of product, the head of design, head of engineering in that product area are naturally invested in figuring out the future beyond the next 6 months or year and so on. And so they're the ideal partners. Hopefully, ideally, they are invested in your research, that they're helping you prioritize, and that they're coming along the journey, and that ultimately you'll have more of an impact because you have these dedicated kind of partners built in. On the other hand, the team that sits more centrally, they have the advantage of thinking beyond, again, as I said, the organizational lines and the products that we already have. So if a product doesn't exist yet, it doesn't yet have a head of design or head of PM to think about it and to worry about it. So that's a big part of the pathfinding research that this group does, is thinking beyond what already exists and where we could go from here. And having both the embedded and the central model allows us to kind of lean into the strengths of each of those as we shape up the future of our products at Facebook. You might be asking, what does a pathfinding researcher do on a daily basis? And again, that really varies. We come from different backgrounds. So our pathfinding researchers, some are ethnographers, some are qualitative researchers, we have quantitative researchers. And so by nature, so naturally the type and scope of projects that we take on really varies. At Facebook, we're really encouraged to lean into our strengths as individuals. So when you're thinking about what projects to take on and how you can have the most impact, we're looking for that perfect marriage of your individual strengths and, of course, like marrying that up with the questions and the priorities that you set out with your stakeholders. And because of that, because we come from different backgrounds, the types of projects that we work on, the methodologies that we use are different. In general, I would say that pathfinding research tends to be larger scope. It tends to be, of course, more exploratory. We take more risks. And we also don't optimize it for immediate impact. And that's maybe one of the challenges, in that we can't, the next performance cycle, you can't necessarily point out to like what your research impacted in products like other researchers or other roles could do, but that's part of the role and the experience. So they tend to be larger in scope, they're more exploratory, and we also try to optimize it for more collaboration. It's really nice to partner up with other pathfinding researchers or other non-pathfinding researchers to work on these larger scope projects. So I can definitely share a few examples of the projects that I worked on to help give you a taste of pathfinding research at Facebook. So the first couple that I will share are what I would just think of as foundational research. At the core of it, I really believe in understanding people and understanding, as I mentioned, their needs, their motivations. And I really feel like by kind of going back to those basics, you really can help identify new areas where you can serve your users. So the first couple of the projects that I will share that I will argue actually have been the most successful are what I would just think of as foundational research. The first one was on sharing needs. So the first team that I joined was the sharing team, and as my first project, I wanted to understand people's motivations for sharing, like whether they're sharing their big or small moments, small things in their lives, they're sharing their thoughts, feelings, and opinions. I really wanted to understand kind of what drives all of that. And I wanted to look at all types of sharing, in person, on the phone, using different apps, using social media, and so on and so forth. So I started this out as a big diary study in the US. I collected lots of examples of things and scenarios that people are sharing across different mediums. And then I started analyzing and grouping them. And I identified 7 different types of sharing, 7 different motivations for why people shared. And of course, designed a framework around this. So the framework was built around these 7 different types of sharing and give an example and illustrate those. So what do you think happened when I shared this framework? Immediately after, it raised more and more questions. So how big are each of these sharing needs? How important is each of them for Facebook? How does it differ by age, by gender, by your life stage, or your tenure on the platform? How does it differ globally? So a lot more questions came out of this, but the awesome part was that other researchers almost immediately dove in to answer some of these questions. So they took on and they quantified the sharing needs, for example. They replicated the study in other countries. They validated it globally. They built personas. And they started sharing and socializing these needs in their teams and across the company. What I would think is one of the main signs of success for this is that the sharing needs are now part of the everyday vocabulary that our product teams use. So whether it's in a design sprint or in product road mapping or jobs to be done framing, these needs and this vocabulary keeps coming up over and over again. Like at least once a week, often, a lot more often, I'm in a meeting or a discussion where we're trying to decide what product to build or how, and a PM or engineer or designer refers back to these needs. And I think that's really awesome, and that's why I'm proud of this, one of the first projects that I did. Another example that I will share is actually one that I did as part of the central pathfinding team. So this project aimed to identify and articulate the core value of Facebook. You think we'd know that, but if you asked across the company, there wasn't like really a unified and clear idea of it. We had done a lot of research on why people come to Facebook, why they open the app, why they click on different things. But if you had to think like at the core of it, at the deepest level of why people keep Facebook in their lives, even though they have concerns about it or they have challenges with the platform, we didn't have that answer. We wanted to really understand what it is that Facebook is offering to people, what value are we serving, and how is that unique. So in this project, we took a much more ethnographic approach. So rather than starting it just by myself, right away from the beginning, we put a big research team together. We went to 6 different parts of the world, and we spent hundreds of hours with different people. We followed our participants for 2 full days and really tried to get an understanding of them as people, of the people in their lives, of their the things that they do online and offline, and their contacts, and all of that good stuff. And then we came back to our offices with lots of stories and mountains of data, and then we started synthesizing all of that. I'd say the analysis for this project was one of the most challenging and exciting. It really took a village and many iterations until we went from the immediate observations, the things that people said, the things that they did, the things that we observed in their context, to really distill it down to the few words that we identify as being the core value of Facebook. I would say that it was both simple and profound at the same time. And it's been already being used in terms of our long-term product strategy. Of course, you have to know the value that you're bringing to your users now before you think about the next ways that you want to increase, you want to evolve your products or new products that you're building. So again, I think while it was something pretty fundamental, it was really great to start at the basics, start at understanding what the value of it is now, so that we can feed into the future of the products. So far pretty fundamental. We can take it to a little bit more of an extreme. You might be familiar with extreme user research. If you're not, the idea is to understand and observe people at the either end of an extreme this might be the spectrum of their attitudes or engagement with a certain product, for example. Because when you look at the extremes, you'll notice that people's needs and motivations and pain points are much more exaggerated. They're much more easy to detect and understand. And you'll notice that they've often come up with interesting workarounds to accomplish their goals. And so by understanding the extremes, you can often take the same needs or pain points or drivers that you identified and actually realize that they apply to the rest of your users in the middle of the curve as well. And I found extreme user research to be really useful for pathfinding. So one of the recent examples of extreme user research that I did actually brought me to Southeast Asia less than a month ago. And in this project, we looked at markets that were kind of really on the most engaged with a certain feature. And within those markets, we looked at the demographics that were most engaged with the feature and had the highest use. And then we really took it to the extreme and talked to the top 1% of our users globally who were using this product. And we called them product heroes. So this product heroes research helped us see what was working really well for these for the heroes, but why they use the product and use it so extensively, and to learn from what it is that we can actually unlock for other people. And also we noticed some shortcomings. So there's things that they were not familiar with or they didn't know how to use. And if your product hero doesn't know how to use it, oftentimes that really applies to other users as well. Other researchers actually took on the other extreme. So there's a couple other researchers that went to different markets and studied different demographics, different users who were on the low end of the extreme of engagement. And again, by understanding their barriers that they were experiencing at that extremes, they really could identify some of the deterrents that the rest of our users are probably facing too in much more subtle ways that we could try to remove. Another example of an extreme research was actually doing research with the oldest population of our users on the platform. So a group of researchers noticed that as a company, we focused so much on different age groups, especially youth. We had like entire teams working on youth research, but that there wasn't a lot of research with our oldest users. So they noticed this gap in our knowledge, and they also thought of this as, you know, if you can solve the needs for your older users, you're improving the experience for them and for everybody else, and also start to anticipate the needs that might be evolving for all of us, all of our users, as we are aging alongside Facebook. So finally, let's explore one other dimension, and that is analogous experiences. This is the last example that I will share, and this is about learning from other domains. So in a lot of the research projects that I do, of course, you know, we pick our participants and our methodology and so on based on the questions that we're trying to answer. But as a bonus, I try to include a few interviews or immersion activities or site visits with experts from other fields. So this could be artists, or I'll share some examples with you. I found that by looking at other domains or analogous experiences, you can often find a new perspective or come up with needs or inspirations that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise if you just stuck to the primary domain of the research. So to give you an example, I guess the more important part here is knowing how to pick these analogous experiences to take the most out of them. Last year I was doing research on ephemeral sharing. So things like Facebook stories, then you put something out there and it expires and so on. And to do this research, we were doing this in Latin America. So of course we had our main participants and our main sessions. I added a bunch of other interviews and site visits with people who were doing some sort of self-expression that was either on the very kind of ephemeral side, very transient, or on the other hand, it was very on the on the permanent side. So we met with artists, musicians, and kind of cultural groups, religious groups that kind of were experts in either of this ephemeral or permanent kind of self-expression. So to give you some examples, we met with street artists as well as tattoo designers. And this was kind of like two different mediums that were kind of experimenting with something that was very ephemeral or out of your control once you put it out there versus something that was very permanent. And it was interesting to kind of see their usage of the different mediums, the constraints that each of those had, and their approach to their expression, and kind of draw inspiration from that. We met with a local samba group, and they gathered weekly, they lit a candle, and then they started jamming together. And they would play, recite their poetry, they would play music all night until this candle died. So the length of their expression and kind of shared experience was very much out of their hands, and it was determined by this candle, which we thought was really interesting. We also met with a family who designed flower carpets for religious ceremonies. So they would spend weeks on the design and preparing the materials, and then on the day of the ceremony, the whole family, from grandfather to the kids, to the grandkids, would labor for hours and hours building this huge ephemeral carpets, knowing that as soon as the ceremony would start, that they would kind of be destroyed. And again, seeing these examples and understanding the people who kind of playing around in these mediums, looking at the ways that they deal with the constraints and the nature of these mediums, kind of gave us some interesting ideas and inspiration that keeps coming up in our examples that we use in our design sprints and so on. Later in the year, we went to Korea. And given that this was Korea, I thought that we would really kind of go on the other extreme. We would look into the most advanced immersive experiences in AR and VR and kind of the advanced technology that we could find there. So we met with a startup that did really interesting things with virtual reality. We immersed ourselves in the most interesting kind of immersive futuristic experiences that we could. But actually the thing that was the most meaningful inspiration actually came from where we least expected it. Our last interview was with an artist who visited in his studio, and his designs were really, really kind of on the other end of the spectrum, really physical, tactical experiences with everyday objects, including furniture. He had zero interest in AR and VR. He wasn't even on social media, but we ended up getting inspiration from some of the things that he was doing. So as you see, he's really, in both this design and other pieces of his work, he's really playing around with the dimensions, like flattening out 2D and 3D dimensions and kind of messing around with that. And although it had nothing to do with Facebook and sharing, this really fascinated us. And I remember being with a couple of designers and an engineer who came along this interview, and right away we started geeking out about his other projects, about how he messes around with different dimensions in his artwork, and then started to start this inkling and questioning for us about how we could learn from that and perhaps apply it to the mediums that we dabble in. So I remember being in the car after the interview and being out for drinks later that night, and the weeks that followed the research, we would keep coming back to this example and would ask questions like, how do we encapsulate more dimensions of the real life into the things that people share? How do we flatten or add dimensionality to what people are sharing online? How do we capture movement or passing of time in a still photo? And so these ideas and questions kept coming up until we gave it a name. We called it Breathing Life into Moments. And as soon as we gave this a name, something interesting happened. Our engineers had a hackathon in December, and they decided to dedicate the whole hackathon to this concept of breathing life into moments. Earlier this year, we had a design sprint, and again, we started diving more into this idea and brainstorming about how we could add more dimensionality or experiment with dimensions of time and movement and so on in the things that people are sharing. So really what started out as this kind of unlikely interview ended up giving us a new creative brief that we keep using in our work. So really what I wanted to end on is that sometimes it pays to take a step back and go to the very basics, the most fundamental things about your product, or take the less obvious path when you're designing your research. And that's one of my favorite parts of pathfinding research at Facebook. So I hope that the things that I shared started some questions in your mind. Are you already doing research of this nature? Do you need more of it? if your organization was to invest in more pathfinding, how would that kind of fit into the organization? Would it be individuals who purely think about this kind of questions, or would you be adding more of this kind of flavor to the work that you're already doing? So I started out personally as a developer who had no access to research. Then I became a researcher who focused on getting the right design. And finally, as a pathfinder, I'm all the way back to the beginning, finding the right product, then thinking about getting the right design and design right. And one last note, and that hopefully is obvious, but I think is worth noticing, worth reminding ourselves of, is that all the examples that I shared, whether it was understanding the core value of Facebook, or figuring out a sharing needs framework, or coming up with a new creative brief, all of them had one thing in common. And that was coming up with a shared vocabulary that myself and my teams, engineering, product designers, keep using. And coming up with these words and coming up with a shared language, I think, is one of the reasons why I think these projects have been successful. So I just encourage you, the next time that you're sharing an insight or an idea or research finding, to really take one step back and think about the words, the way that you're communicating it. Is it clear? Is it concise? Will it stick? And hopefully by kind of coming up with a shared understanding of our users and a shared terminology in which we talk about our products, our values, a North Star, you can bring more to your teams in terms of getting the right product, getting the right design, and getting that design right. Sorry I went a few minutes over time, but I'll end that here.
That's okay. Round of applause, please.
Buka aja Bukalapak.